Hey, what's up, guys? I hope everyone's well. Wanted to come in quickly and introduce episode number 5 of the Roosters Crow podcast. I was able to have a very fascinating and dialogue with JP Marceau. JP Marceau is the editor of the Symbolic Wrld blog, and we had a great engagement and exchange of ideas and thoughts about symbolism and science, miracles, and the placebo effect. We talked about consciousness, Rene Girard, and a bunch of other topics that I think you will find interesting. So please let me know in the comments, and please engage with any of these ideas. Would love to engage with you back. And I'm going to share with you this kind of intro and logo that I had made for me. Not really sure how I feel about it yet, but hope you guys enjoy the podcast, and we'll see you in a bit. All right, welcome to episode number 5 of the Roosters Crow podcast, a podcast that looks to engage with ideas, people, and culture that, like the Roosters Crow, are sending out signals of warning and caution, but also signals of hope, discernment, and viable ways forward. Today, I'm very excited to have Jean-Philippe, aka JP Marceau, on to learn more about him and his work with Jonathan Pageau and the Symbolic Wrld blog, of which he is chief editor. JP has been front and center in the hyper or meta conversation that's been happening around symbolism, science, society, and religion. He's had excellent exchanges with cognitive scientist John Vervaeke, the prolific YouTuber and pastor Paul Vanderklay, and most recently with Jonathan Pageau discussing the ontological nature of miracles. So I can't think of a better topic or a better guest to bring you just 2 days here after Christmas. JP, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, James, and thanks for reaching out.
Absolutely. Glad to have you. So I got a set of questions here for you, but I'd like to, before we kind of get into it, let's talk a little about what were you like? What was JP like as a kid? And how did your social and religious upbringing affect or inform your current understanding of being in the world?
Yeah, sure. So I was born in the Quebec City area in Canada, in the Catholic part of Canada, really. And yes, I was brought up within that tradition, but it wasn't all that serious, and I didn't take it all that seriously. So I distanced myself from that when I was sometime, the typical stuff at some point in my teenage years when I was learning about other religions and also learning about science. So I was looking for an excuse to leave, and this was giving me excuses. So progressively, I was able to stop going there. Progressively became, I was very interested in science and mathematics, so I started to see the world this way, and I was getting positive feedback just from doing well in school and so on. But at some point, it became obvious that this worldview wasn't providing anything very high in terms of morality. Like, you can do a lot of stuff, but there's no real reason within that system to actually do things, and what would be good or bad in that system. So for that reason, I ended up stopping my study. I finished some studies. I did my undergrad in mathematics and computer science because I was interested mainly by the philosophical aspects of naturalism, especially in the mathematics and computer science area, on the theory part about how it is that logic functions and how far can we push logic and so on. But after learning that this wasn't gonna bring that much fruits, I finished that up and then jumped into graduate studies in philosophy. They let me jump almost right back in. I had to do like just a few undergrad classes and then was able to jump into a master's. And my main goal really was to try and see if I could find some alternative ontology, something that isn't materialistic and naturalistic, but that still works and that would provide some telos, some good, some value. I was very pessimistic. I didn't think it would work because I was so deeply materialistic and naturalistic. Because it was sort of the worldview that I had implicitly gathered from all of my scientific schooling. But so I started by really attacking the hard problem of consciousness, because it seemed like the biggest chink in that worldview. I wasn't all that hopeful. And even if you solve the mind-body problem, it doesn't mean that you'll automatically get something that really tells you something about morality, for instance. But still, I thought it was a good line of attack, so that's what I went with. And it took much less time than I had expected. I wasn't really expecting for an answer, but within, I'd say, a year or two, I had something decent, because it turns out that some people have either provided good solutions already, or that in some other philosophical systems, this problem just didn't show up at all. So for instance, there was no real hard problem of consciousness if you go back to the Greeks or to the Middle Ages, because people didn't think it in the narrow metaphysics of materialism or reductive kinds of naturalism. So anyways, that I found some, let's say, thinkers that were influenced by Neoplatonism that provide some good answers there. And then around that same time, I learned about Jordan Peterson, about Jonathan Peugeot, and through a series of different ways, ended up making my way back to the Catholic Church that I had been brought into. Lots of the philosophical questions that I had were answered, philosophically within that tradition, and also because I already done my catechesis within that church, so I could sort of just jump right back in. And so to try and conclude on your question, I'd say my upbringing as a Catholic when I was young, and then later embedding myself into the naturalistic worldview, has meant that in terms of the work I'm doing on symbolism right now, a lot of it is aimed at, let's say, myself 4 or 5 years ago, when I was sort of looking for answers, when I was still materialistic and naturalistic. And so I try to provide ways to understand, let's say, what Jonathan is doing, or what some of the church fathers, or what Aquinas was doing, explaining it in a way that will be understandable to a materialist or a naturalist, like the kind of person that I was 4 or 5 years ago. So you'll see that my approach to symbolism is a bit different from, let's say, what Jonathan says. I try to use many scientific examples, because that's the categories I used to think in, rather than using, let's say, first person experience of the things at the human scale. I try to go at the different scales of reality. I give examples, in biology or physics, or I give examples at the sociological level or cosmological level, because I'm trying to use categories that naturalists will understand. So yes, so my background as a naturalist shapes the way that I frame my symbolic understanding.
Wow, beautiful. Resonates a lot. I had a similar path getting into philosophy, and then dealing with the hard problem in terms of how David Chalmers, elucidates it. Maybe we can discuss it a little bit, I guess. And you just brought something to light. The hard problem it was a manufactured problem, like you said. It wasn't really a problem for the ancients, and I think that the heart problem won't get solved. It'll go away once this framework is kind of realized. So the heart problem is kind of, I understand it, is how do neurons firing in our head relate to the conscious experience that we have of the world. And again, I think it's a heart problem because it's embedded in this specific materialist worldview that will be resolved and is going to be resolved, but it's not going to be a big deal. It's not going to be like problems just go away. There's not going to be a big resolution. I think that's kind of already happening. So yeah, I resonate a lot with that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
think,
and and I also, but just quickly, you said I see a lot of people out there that were like me 3-4 years ago as well. And I want to reach out to them, I think, like you do, not to convince them of my worldview or to convince them. I want to help people just appreciate or see this worldview and then experience it and make their own discernments of it. So it's like, I just want to help, show this worldview, and then, hey, do with it what you will. And I'd love to hear criticisms, or love to hear if there's chinks in it and kind of dialogue there. But from the people I talk to, it's not like we're trying to convince people of a Pajovian worldview, or, it's not, it's different in that sense. So I resonate with that as well, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. There's, I guess, two things that I'm trying to to use to frame the way I speak to myself 4 or 5 years ago to that kind of people is I don't try to convince people as much as I try to, let's say, just explain things, make things clear, because it would be nice if people didn't have to spend all the time that I had to spend to understand this stuff. Because I had to take like 2-3 years of grad school full time to start to get an understanding of all this, and then it took me still lots of time afterwards to dig deeper into what Jonathan is saying or some of what the church fathers were saying. And yeah, it took a really long time. And I remember back then when I was, let's say, trying to find some podcasts or some YouTube videos to listen to about some subjects, while I'm doing something else, and there just wasn't really any, like, on this problem and this theory of mind, for instance, can you link that up to something in the symbolic worldview? What would Aquinas have had to say about this stuff? These videos just didn't even exist. So I'm trying to at least lay them out. And in doing so, yeah, it's rare that convincing people actually works. Some people do. Like, some people have a temperament where it's a directed arguments for or against something will really convince them. But for the kind of topics in symbolism, I think it's more about like opening people's eyes to stuff, because a lot of it is about coming up with good examples that make people realize that there's a pattern behind things that they're seeing, and that they can use it to understand some other stuff. So yeah, and yeah, then there's lots of examples of what we do in what Jonathan does, and he tries to use some simple pattern of, let's say, he always uses the cup, and he tries to use something super simple like that to show that there's a pattern in there that applies to some other things at other scales of reality. And it's more about showing people that you can use a pattern for something else, more so than having, okay, I have this deductive arguments in 4 steps that convinces you of this thing. And then the other thing with the mind-body problem you mentioned is, I guess there are a few strategies that are really emerging right now in this area, because Chalmers put the problem really clearly, like about 25 years ago now, and most of the literature at the time was reductionistic in one way or another, and now people are becoming, let's say, either non-reductive physicalists, which is almost a kind of Platonism, where you acknowledge that there are patterns at different layers of reality and that they're not reductible. So consciousness is just like one pattern at a certain layer of reality. And then there are other alternatives like panpsychism, of people saying that there will be consciousness at all those different levels. And then at some point you still wind up having really to go back to Platonism to answer some more specific problems that you get in panpsychism. So it seems that, I guess, for some people, the problem will just disappear once enough people have done the precise steps of walking their way back almost to Platonism or to Aristotelianism or whatever other worldviews where patterns like consciousness like actually existed and had a real place. And like once enough people have done this, then maybe the problem will just fade away. But for some people, like the problem is still very strong, very vivid. Like if you're used to seeing the world in material terms, in terms of atoms and energy and neurons and all that stuff, it's hard to make out the patterns above all of this stuff. Like what patterns take shape upon this matter, and to take those patterns seriously enough to establish a relationship between them, those patterns, and your mind, your consciousness that actually exists, to see that, okay, patterns have a real influence upon the world. And once you have this place in the world for patterns, then you can put your consciousness back in there. And it's not just for consciousness, it will apply it then at a bunch of other scales of reality. There are patterns that hold at the social scale in societies, and those patterns exist and they take shape in individuals and buildings and that stuff. You could look lower too, and let's say the patterns that hold in a cell, those patterns are real. They're not the same kind of consciousness that we are, the same kind of mind, but they're still like simpler patterns and they actually exist. And so once it's funny, one way to say it is that by being materialistic and reductionistic for a while, people like had gotten rid of patterns at tons of different layers of reality. Like, okay, sociology, it's like you can just reduce it to psychology, doesn't really exist. Psychology, you can reduce that to biology, doesn't really exist. And you keep trying to reduce everything down. And But at some point, if you just keep trying to reduce everything, then you have the problem of, okay, well, like it doesn't feel like my consciousness is reducible to something lower. Like it doesn't feel like it's just neurons. And people give precise arguments, but the basic idea, the basic intuition is just this: that my consciousness doesn't seem reducible to anything, especially not to something dead like like atoms. Doesn't really seem to work. So, but once people try to find a place for this pattern, for the conscious level pattern, then it opens the way to say that the patterns are real at all of these other layers of reality, and you end up solving a bunch of other problems. So yeah, this has been an interesting development in philosophy of mind, which has been causing some other stuff in other metaphysical problems in philosophy, and even now in cognitive science. So yeah, exciting times.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, well said. I think it's interesting that I see it like the way that Jonathan talks about it, or we're trying to, or you're trying to articulate here is this. It's like Heidegger's truth is something that is disclosed. It is appropriated through a clearing, which opens up a path to understand the world in a sense. And I think just like you, I mean, just going down to the bare bones of looking at what makes up things and what makes up cells, and then made up of molecules, and then atoms. What are the relationship between the atoms? And then the protons and the neutrons and the subatomic particles. Okay, you've broken everything down, and it's like I see it that it's just a category mistake. You're trying to explain something. I had this idea of when you watch a movie that affects you, the ending makes you cry, and it moves you to tears. It's like, why did that happen? Let me look at the components of the television. Let me break them down into smallest pieces. Maybe that'll tell me why I started crying. No, let me look at my neurons. Let me look at the specific areas of my brain that are firing. That'll tell me why I feel love and appreciation from the ending of this movie. And it's like, those things are real. Like you're saying, those exist. They are material processes, but they can't explain the movement that was within you. And however, there are things that can explain that, not totally, but it will open up the mystery even more. And I think so I resonate a lot with where you're coming from, and kind of doing the work of digging through the materialism, the philosophy of mind, and engaging with those arguments, and then being like, okay, it gives you some gravity and some credence to be able to say, hey, look, there's this view that is not instead of this materialistic view, but it discloses it even more in a sense. So yeah, I appreciate that, man. I think that was very well said. Yeah, I guess the second question here. So similar to what I asked Jonathan, why is symbolism appearing in the world now? And what is your mission and goal as editor of the Symbolic Wrld blog?
Yeah, I think it's appearing. It's related to what we just said about really the mind-body problem, because there have been lots of problems have popped up in philosophy, and they have their mirror in the popular culture, just because people have existential problems that correspond to those abstract philosophical problems. But in general, the issues they all have to do with the fact that let's say the naive, scientistic, materialistic, reductionistic worldview leaves a bunch of holes, metaphysically speaking, and people have been trying to solve them. And as you try to solve them, you seem to be making your way back to something that was more traditional, more a more kind of classical metaphysics that you would find in the Church Fathers, or in Aquinas, or in the Greek philosophers. So there are several. Let's say, just at the level of abstract philosophy, a few powerful ones are we just talked about the mind-body problem. Another one is the fact that the entities that you actually get, if you just try to build up this reductionistic worldview, they actually sort of vanish. Like it doesn't actually, it never tells you like what is the nature of what you're studying. So for instance, if you try to study an electron, the physicist will be able to tell you that, okay, the electron follows these laws and it has this mass and this charge, for instance. But all of this stuff doesn't tell you what the electron is. It just tells you how the electron behaves. You know that if you plug this mass and this charge in this equation, then you'll get this output, and this means that the electron will behave this way. But you never know what the electron is. Even saying that it has a certain mass and a certain charge just means that if you put these numbers into this equation, you'll get this. So you know why things okay, so you know how things behave, you don't know why they behave this way. You never actually explain anything. And even worse, Ned Block has the cruncher argument, where if you actually, like, we've tried this. It was a good, let's say, working hypothesis to try and reduce things to their constituents and then see how the constituents make up the whole. It worked for a bunch of stuff. We could explain interesting things in physics. We could explain a bunch of cosmological phenomena using this. We could reduce parts of chemistry to physics, for instance. We've been able to do this for a bunch of stuff, but it hasn't been as useful as we thought. Like, it's not clear that we can reduce even just chemistry to physics. Like, there are debates in the philosophy of chemistry that doesn't seem like we'll be able to do that. But even just if you look just at physics itself, like, you don't get to, like, constituent parts really. If you keep digging lower into physics, at some point things just vanish into pure probability. Like, it's just matter, like the old matter that Aristotle told us about, like, 2,500 years ago, or that let's say Chinese philosophy was telling us about yin, or what the Abrahamic religions have been telling us about the earth. Like, we just bottom up to something traditional at the lower scale, and then so you have a problem just in our modern worldview. So but this is abstract philosophical problems that only bother, I don't know, one person in 1,000 that cares really about this stuff. But this abstract stuff also has repercussions, or I shouldn't say repercussions. Like, this is the head of a problem that takes its body within existential problems for, like, real people, like everyday everyone. So, for instance, the mind-body problem causes a separation for people from between their minds and their bodies. You can say, like, all of these abstract philosophical problems, they match up to the zombie, really. Like, people don't know how their consciousness can fit into their naive scientific worldview, where things are made up of matter. Like, we live in a world of machines. We like, all our buildings are square stuff, very like, decomposable into their units. People don't live in nature or within organic styles of houses, so we tend to think into reductionistic ways. It's the way that we spontaneously see the world, at least a lot of us. And within that reductionistic worldview, we don't see how consciousness can fit. Like, how do you exactly fit, emotions, feelings, the blue of this stuff, and so on. You don't have really a place for it. So it alienates people. It alienates people's experiences from their world. It disconnects their head from their body. So that's why we wonder about zombies or about robots, because we don't know whether we are zombies and robots. We don't know what's the link between our consciousness and our bodies. And another problem you can bring up is also ethics, because once you disconnect our consciousness from our body, you have a bunch of other problems, really. For instance, I mean, if we're not even sure about our own consciousness, then we're of course not certain about values, whether values actually exist, especially with pluralism. It seems that there are all kinds of different ways that societies can organize themselves. So we don't know, like, are there good ones? Are there bad ones? Or are we just sort of different hordes of zombies roaming around? We sort of don't know about this stuff. So because of all these kinds of problems, symbolism is coming back up, because symbolism is the study of how those different layers of being can stack up, can work together, how you can learn something at one layer by looking at something at another layer, how you can learn something that's going on at one place in a certain layer, to how you can use that to learn something about something else that goes on at the same layer but elsewhere. So I think symbolism is coming back up to solve those different issues, whether they be philosophical or existential for people. And the role that I'm trying to play is, okay, so yeah, we talked about earlier about the fact that I want to help people understand this, especially people who are in the position that I was in a few years ago. And then the blog is a particular way for me to contribute to do this. So I can write articles that help people understand this, and I can also help contributors to the blog by editing their articles and hopefully making it clearer. And it's a way for for people to get, myself included, because when I write something, I send it to editors too, because I'm not the only editor on the blog.
Mm-hmm.
It allows us to get feedback from one another. I bend with feedback. We can comment on a lot more stuff than if we just, let's say, put out a video and people like comment below. So we can, let's say, sharpen our thoughts this way, and then also people can just read it and give their comments as well. So I think the blog is playing a part in all this and all this revival of symbolism that we just have to contribute to, I think, because there are too many issues, whether they be philosophical or existential, and there's a real hunger for it. I think the whole framework of trying to reduce things down to a certain layer is not paying off anymore. So I'm trying just to contribute to bringing something back that used to work, and to do this and making it palatable to modern people, I have to try to bridge, to explain how, using modern, even materialistic examples, we can try and make our way back to the way ancients saw things.
Yeah, well said. Wow, so much came up for me there. It seems like that the soil has been tilled from, the postmodern disintegration of all metaphysics as such, right? And that soil is now ripe for new growth and for seeds to be planted. And I think that there are ears to hear now of this type of thinking that there wasn't before. I don't know if that was a necessary process for that to happen, of all of these large metaphysical institutions and ideas that have been disintegrated, whether it's the idea of the church or the state even. And we're still seeing the kind of tail end of that, and we're seeing it, I think, both intensify and putter out as these new ways of looking at the world. It kind of makes me think of like a phenomenological realism, right? If you see that these things are real, emotions and whatnot, they're not just a result or can be reduced to the reactions in the brain, but are actual parts of the broader pattern, like you're saying here. And I think maybe this question and a couple of more will dig into some of the insights you just brought there. So I guess this is right into what you were just talking about here. How do you see symbolism's role? I guess we can dig in a little bit more with regards to bridging the gap between science and authentic tradition. How can we dig in and connect the head and the body? Because you and I are very intrigued with these philosophical notions. We're probably, obsessed with them too much. Your family's like, why do you think about this stuff? Stuff all the time, enough, but you got to connect it with the body. And I see a lot with, very interested in what John Vervaeke and Jordan Hall are doing and what the Game B group are doing. And I think just recent conversations they've had have been starting to get into this territory, because I get frustrated. They're talking about how all of these different incentive structures, how to reorganize the economy and society. And I get to the point, like, what are we going to organize around? What are we going to unify around? Like, what is going to bring people together? And something that I think is missing is worship. How can worship, what is the right way to think about worship, and how can that potentially bridge the gap between science and religion and the head and the body?
Yeah. I think a good way to understand it is, for people, especially who are interested by the philosophical aspect of things, like ritual and established traditions will really allow you to connect things. I can even just tell the story of how I sort of was able to jump back in precisely because of symbolism. So initially, when I was I initially was working on those ideas just philosophically, as I was telling you, trying to understand, okay, what's the relationship between the mind and the body? What's like, how can you somehow fit in vices and virtues as moral patterns that actually exist in the world? Like, how does the church come into this? Like, how do different traditions deal with these kinds of issues? So I was listening to Jonathan's videos and talking with him from time to time. And once I had, let's say, a basic enough understanding of what was going on, I started going back to church. And initially, I wasn't, my understanding was very rudimentary. Like, I didn't have any really idea of what even to make of God, like not even really a basic idea. But I had enough of an inkling of how it is that societies can coexist, that I was able to jump into liturgy and see like see enough of what I'm doing for it to be, let's say, interesting, engaging, and fruitful. So I was able to see that, okay, let's say, why is it that at this point we all get up, we all say these words, and then we go in procession to receive the Eucharist? So once I add, let's say, enough of an understanding of, okay, well, I think the same way that, let's say, my head orders the different members of my body and listens to them, the way that there's a hierarchical organization where, okay, my body sends all kinds of signals of what it receives to my head, and in my head they all can cohere together. So and they become turned into higher level patterns that are much richer than what was just going on in the members. So let's say when certain sound waves hit my eardrums, this is just like quick vibrations that don't really mean much if we were to just look at my ear. But all of these different signals, once they reach certain regions of my brain and they cohere all together, they turn into a higher level pattern that corresponds to certain words that have all kinds of meanings that you wouldn't have found if you were to just look at the level of vibrations in my eardrums, for instance. So the head can gather all kinds of information that occurs at the different levels in the members, and then conversely, the head can then send signals that will trickle down to, let's say, my mouth, so that I will say these words that I'm saying right now. Again, the conscious pattern of me saying these words, it's more abstract. It exists at a higher level than if you were to just look at what happens within my vocal cords, for instance, very quick vibrations in my vocal cords that don't mean anything by themselves. Okay, so you can have sort of the lower coming up into the higher, and then the higher responding into the lower. So once I had this basic idea, I was able to go and participate into liturgy and try to understand like what were the instantiations of this head-body pattern going on at the communal scale within the church. And there are all kinds of instances of this, like, okay, we all get up together, we all say the same words. The priest, after engaging with all of us, will then say certain other words. So you have this idea that what the different people do in the pew, what they say, the way they sing, the way they go to confession, all of these different things, they get gathered up into a common story, like a church that actually exists, because people like physically go there because they all send, let's say, signals to the head, which is like the priest. And then conversely, the priest will take all of this information, turns it into a higher level pattern, a story, the story of the parish, for instance, and then you will mediate back between this parish with its story, which fits within the story of the different churches within the tradition that ultimately comes from Christ. And you will see what you will give information, give signals that will then trickle down to the different members of the parish, so that they will, let's say, manifest the story within their own lives. So once I could see that the basic pattern of the head and the body, which allowed me to understand the relation between the mind and the body within a certain individual, was able to transfer to the pattern of the head and the body in a church between, say, the priest and the story of the parish, and then the body of the parish, which is the parishioners. Once I was able to get this basic symbolic insight, then I could participate into liturgy, and it turned into, initially it was a difficult abstract exercise, I would say, because I'm trying to understand, okay, why are we doing this? And then I would sort of run through the arguments. But after you do it enough, at some point, it starts to just click and become instinctive. And then you can start to notice more and more fine-grained things, or more and more abstract and relevant patterns. You just endless, you can keep digging and digging. And it's the same kind of thing that happens when you're, let's say, trying to learn a new language, I guess. Initially, you have to really think about stuff, and it's not intuitive at all. And it's your head and your body is very disconnected. Like, you can't really make out what's coming from your ears. You can't really say what you want. Your lips don't obey your mind, for instance. But at some point, it becomes instinctive. Like, you're starting to connect your mind. You're starting to connect the abstract language to your body, to your actual like system. So over time, by engaging in ritual, you can do the same kind of stuff where your abstract ideas become incarnated within you. They start to take a body. And not everyone will need this, I think, at least not to the same extent. Not everyone will want to start with this abstract philosophical kind of reasoning, but a significant amount of people, let's say, will do, especially in our corner of the internet, people who are more intellectual and you really care about this stuff. For some others, I think it will be more implicit, or let's say the practice will carry a lot of the work, and then the actual intellectual part will be sort of added on top of it. So for lots of people, just the beauty and the meaning of the liturgy will be enough to get them really involved and get them caring. And then this engine of people just participating will be enough for them to really deepen their symbolic worldview. And then some more abstract stuff can sort of get stacked on top of it, but it won't be as important for those people. And so that's for liturgy, but this extends to a lot of other things as well. Like you can read Christian art. You can watch, or let's see, you can watch some Christian visual art, or you can also read great literature, and you can still learn about all of those patterns. And it can be an abstract exercise, or it can be sort of more existential. But in all of those ways, you'll be able to connect and embody those symbolic patterns more and more.
Oh, beautifully said. Well said. And, it came to mind. This is a question that I asked, that I've been asking all my guests, is how do you know that how do you know this isn't another ideology? Like, how do you know this isn't just another metaphysical framework among many others? How do we know this one is right? And I think what's been coming to mind is the fruits, the outcomes of implementing this worldview, both internally at the individual level. It'll kind of help reorient your mind and your body. You start eating better, you start feeling better, you just become healthier when you integrate this worldview. It happens within families, right? Reconciliation between husband and wife. Again, this idea of unifying multiplicity, like the idea of Christ unifies multiplicity gets lost. And I think a lot of these conversations, rightfully so, are scared to use these words such as Christ and God, right? We tiptoe around them, we call it spirituality or the universe, but how can we specifically use this idea of connecting the head and the body, which I think John Vervaeke's term of reciprocal relevance realization? How can we apply these terms we talked about at the individual, the familial, and at the church level? How about at the government, the governed, and the government? How can we understand? How can we implement this? What would that look like in terms of reorganizing society from a governmental level? Just quickly before you start, I think you can see when decoherence happens, for instance, with the coronavirus measures that are put in place, right? The governed, you can interact and engage the coherence of the governed plan by its implementation by the body, by those that are governed. And if there's decoherence and things are disintegrating, the plan isn't working appropriately, but there is a right way to do it. What would that look like in terms of governance?
Yeah, I can't say that much about this because I really like Jordan's idea that you should make sure that things are working well at your scale, and then you can work your way up the scales until you have enough competence to bring order to higher and higher scales. So I don't know, in precise details, what it would look like at the society level, but I'm very confident that it would start bottom up, and it would probably look like rituals at higher and higher scales. So I think it will be very difficult for any meaningful body to hold together without rituals that actually allow it to come together. Even in totalitarian states, they needed some kind of ritual to hold the state together. Like the Nazis had all these kinds of rallies. The communists had all of these little groups where they would do stuff too. They would people would actually get together and say things together. They would cohere into one. Even in totalitarian systems, they had to do this. So I think that if you wanted, let's say, a better system, I think you would need better system. You would need better rituals, and I think that those would start bottom up. You talked about earlier about the fact that, okay, how do you know that you're not just participating in another ideology, in another, let's say, bad kind of symbolism? And you can't be sure, because I think as soon as you're sure that you're not within an ideology, you're probably in an ideology. So more likely than not, I think it's going to be about validating at whatever scale you're at that things are getting better, that you're not getting walloped. So if, let's say, you adopting a more symbolic worldview makes your life better, and then the lives of people around you better, then you know that you can be fairly certain that at least for now you're on the right track. So you can try to keep expanding, and then if, let's say, your friends and other people maybe in your community start to think that you're helping them go in a good direction too, then that's further indication that you're going into the right direction, and that you're, let's say, moving up the scales of moving up really the scales of symbolism in a positive way. And then at some point, if you're able to start something bigger, then that's even better. But yeah, I think it's always going to be like something that starts like from an individual, like Christ did. You start something bottom up. You start good relevance realization, let's say, from the bottom up, and if it's good, then it will scale.
Yeah. No, well said. I think it's directly that. I think this was what Christ was talking about. He was talking about relationships between human beings, and I think it's a fractal, and it kind of it bubbles out from the individual to the community. And I agree with you. It's happening it's happening in little pockets everywhere. And I love, and I think like Jordan Hall's ideas from a top down perspective and thinking it through that way. I think that has a lot of a pull and a gravity towards people wanting to get into these types of discussions. And I think that's going to pull more, from people, from individuals, again, from different pockets of the world and the internet, that are going to cohere around this idea. And I don't think there is an answer of what that's going to look like. And I don't think there are leaders out there right now within corporations, within the political world, within Hollywood media. Obviously, we can't look there to leaders to bring us out of whatever that we're in. I think leaders are emerging, but they're not going to be what we think they are, what they have been. It's not going to be what it was, I think. But it's interesting to kind of think through that.
Yeah, there's an interesting fact that I learned about in on the business side of things. For, I think, since about World War II, we tried to think of things really top down. Companies would, let's say, become, say, more authoritarian. You can say that, okay, your superior tells you to do something, and then you do that. And it was sort of the good managerial way of doing things. And we got away with it for a while because we were so rich after like the Second World War, especially in North America, that like we were still prospering despite this. But in the more recent decades, these sort of strictly top-down companies have been really just passed by companies who have a more emerging kind of approach to management. So rather than having the boss who just orders things top down, you listen to the opportunities that your employees are suggesting, and at all scales. So like someone who just got here, let's say 6 months ago, can still have good ideas, can still propose things. And so within a team, people will suggest things. And then what the leader does is to, let's say, select from those, try to make the best possibilities faster. The same kind of things that we do just in our minds. Our consciousness isn't like just one rational dictator that suggests things in the abstract. If you notice what happens in your phenomenology, rather, you have things that suggest themselves to you, and you select from them. That's really like what your consciousness does. And that's true for one human being to hold together. And it's also true for one company to hold together, for one team to hold together. So companies that have been employing this more bottom-up kind of management approaches have been doing much better. And it's part of this whole very interesting modern approach where the hierarchies start to get messed up, because this old like idea of doing things, letting them emerge, like you can find this like, I don't know, 1500 years ago, 2000 years ago in the church, like the principle that things should always get solved at the lowest levels first. Like, don't bother the Pope if there's something in your parish. Like, you try to solve it locally. If the local priests can't handle it, then you bring it to the bishop. If the bishop can't handle it, then he brings it to his cardinal, and then you can keep escalating if necessary. But like, don't bother like the Pope right away. And conversely, you don't want the Pope to be ordering like a priest there to do something. Like, that's not an efficient way to do things. So this old principle that was lost as part of modernity, where we, like, the hierarchy started to get more and more messed up, we started to abstract ourselves, within our own consciousness, to see ourselves as, detached, rational entities. The same way that we started to think that states must be organized in a very strict hierarchical fashion, purely top down. So it's part of this whole fashion, really. And in the same way that good businesses employ a more emerging kind of approach, the same way that good approaches to the human mind also need to employ some kinds of emergent notions. At the level of good social organizations, we're going to have to also integrate that to see how the top-down and the bottom-up can really fit together. And it's probably going to start bottom-up like Christ started it 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, well said. And I think digging into what is a hierarchy, and the 20th century idea that hierarchies as such are bad and need to be destroyed or disintegrated, I think it's impossible. And then really getting to the idea that hierarchies are the way being organizes itself structurally in space and time, right? Whether it's you're making a decision of what music you gravitate towards, what types of movies, what types of hobbies that you have, these things emerge. And I think it's interesting that Christ came to show both that hierarchies are the way that being in the world rolls itself out. Hierarchies become corrupt. There are ways to identify the corruption in the hierarchy while not destroying the body as such, right? And this kind of being able to, and that's how I see the left and the right in terms of politics. There's organization and structure is built. If the organizational structure and the body that embodies it is cohering, you have well-being for all those involved. And that happens, again, like you said, at the corporate level, the governmental level, the individual level. The idea is there is a right way to do things. There is a way in which well-being can be distributed, and that integration and unification happens at all different levels. And having these conversations is exciting because I think we're talking about it at different levels and kind of working out the way that it might emerge. So well said, man. I appreciate that. So yeah, getting into the next question here. So what made you engage with the topic of miracles?
Good question. A few things, really. So on the one hand, I could tell that there was an opportunity there, especially with my conversations with John. We've been talking a lot about emergence, about emanation, and there are things analogous to miracles that happen at all levels of reality, really. Whenever some higher pattern manifests itself into something lower, if you look at it from the lower, it will look like a miracle. So it's true at all kinds of different scales. If you look at how a particle emerges from the bottom layer of physics, this looks like a miracle. If you just know the bottom layer of physics, like why do particles just pop out of this potential? That's super weird. But once you know the higher level pattern, then it doesn't look like a miracle anymore. Oh, okay, that's just because of this law that this happens. Same thing if you look at different scales. If you look at how let's say how all of our billions of neurons cohere just to allow me to say these precise words, it's completely insane. If you just look at it at the level of individual neurons and like how my vocal cords will end up saying because of all these, it's insane. It doesn't make any sense. But once you know the higher level pattern, then it makes sense. Like it doesn't look like a miracle anymore because you know the higher level pattern. So I could tell that there was an opportunity there to talk about miracles. And then the other thing is that, okay, so I talked with a few people. I talk with a few people from time to time in this corner of the internet, and I could tell that this was an issue for some people, especially people coming from the materialist side of things, or even if they're not reductionistic, it's still like jumping to a worldview where there are miracles it's a stumbling block for people, including myself. Like a few years ago, like I don't really know what to do with all those. I could tell that okay, there was some meaning at least in them, and because the tradition was right about so many things, I was willing to take the miracles on faith, really. At some point, you just start to trust people. A good analogy that I've heard, I think it's Bishop Barron, I've heard say this, is it's possible in theory that, let's say, your wife could be a Russian spy. We don't know that she I mean, we can't know for sure that she wasn't like secretly born in Russia and trained by the KGB to do whatever. You can't know for sure, but at some point, you trust that this is not the case because you've talked to her, for a while. You know her enough. There are too many coherent things for you to start doubting her so much that you would suspect that she's a secret KGB agent. But similarly, I was able to take so many of the things that I validated from the church ended up being true. Like because I doubted so many things naturally when I just came in, that after a while, once you see that everything sort of checks out, at some point you start to trust the tradition. So I could sort of trust the tradition on these, but it was very difficult for me to make metaphysical sense of it. I could tell that it was a problem for others, and then I could also see that there was an opening there using the old emergence and domination scheme, because really, I just gave you two examples earlier of, let's say, how particles emerge from the bottom layer of physics, or how consciousness, how a conscious thought emerges from like billions of neurons. Well, it's going to be the same thing between creation as a whole and its creator. There are going to be sometimes weird coherence that happens within creation that are only going to make sense if you use the pattern, if you use the theological patterns between creator and creation as a whole. So that's really the reasons why I wanted to breach the topic. I felt it was relevant to me, to others in this corner of the internet, and also there was an opening there. So that's why I took it.
Excellent. Excellent. I think if we can dig in a little bit to the idea of emergence and emanation, I think emergence is something you hear it a lot. Obviously, consciousness is an emergent phenomenon. We can understand how particles go from, from atoms to molecules to cells to organization to beings. How can we articulate or understand emanation? I think of it as this pulling up forward. I think of it as, as a flower blooms, right? In the terms in my head, I think a flower blooming is how a plant worships. How it's celebrating, it's worshiping in a sense. And I think of trees. You plant a tree and it comes up and it sprouts and it has leaves and whatnot. But there's also this pulling up force that's been lost on us. How can we understand emanation with regards to emergence?
I don't know that I would see it necessarily as a pulling up force. The way that I see emanation is almost as the converse of emergence. So with emergence, you have the lower becoming the higher. How possibilities get actualized into something higher. Emanation is the convert. So rather than having possibilities that get constrained by something higher, emanation is about the higher constraining the lower. So I think it's useful to give examples.
Let's say in from mathematics, like an attractor, a strange attractor, or something like that. It's kind of where my head goes, but I'm still unclear. In terms of a singularity that pulls, like the center of a black hole, right, where it's pulling stuff in, or a strange attractor in terms of mathematics. These are things that come to mind, but please go ahead.
I think that there would be something to do there. I think I'm going to try to give an example that I understand for sure, and then we can try and move to the kind of dynamics examples that you gave. So in a classic example is in the case of the human mind, because when you can see that what happens at the level of our neurons, like all of the different firings that are possible, that's all kinds of potential. So like there are billions and billions of potential configurations that can happen there. Even at any given instant, like it's probabilistic what could happen. Like all kinds of different configuration could take place at the next second, for instance. And the way that all of these possibilities get constrained is a top-down thing, where my mind, my consciousness, the whole pattern of my brain as a whole will put constraints on the possible firings of my individual neurons. So it's these constraints is the emanation process. So it's a process of emanation is a process of constraining of the potential that is below, and conversely, emergence is the process of the potential getting actualized into something actual. So it's in case of you can bring in the kinds of dynamical systems. Yeah, you can bring in the kind of dynamical systems image that you were bringing earlier. In a dynamical system that has actual randomness in it, there are all kinds of possibilities that can take place. You can think of a biological organism, like all kinds of different chemical reactions and hormonal transfers and all that stuff can take place. But there are going to be certain, let's say, attractor states within this complex system that will constrain the possibility coming on from the organism. And from those constraints, the potential will get shaped into something actual. So okay, and it can even be helpful to bring a third thing. So we have the emergence of how the potential gets actualized into something. You have the top-down thing of how the constraints will shape an underlying potential. And then the thing that's between the two is what John Vervaeke calls relevance realization. Relevance realization is how the many gets constrained into the one, or how the potential gets constrained into something actual. So in anything that actually exists, you'll see this pattern. Even something as simple as let's say this cup here, there's a certain pattern of the cup. There's a form, like a structure, an abstract structure that contains all of those different atoms, for instance. If you look at the scale of the atoms here, there's all kinds of potential there. Like there's all kinds of vibrations. There are like photons being taken in and then taken out. There's all kinds of variations, all kinds of movements, of vibrations, and all that stuff that can take place. But from all of that potential, the shape of the cup as a whole constrains that potential into something actual, into the cup as it exists at this instant. And this process of emanation of the shape and emergence from the potential occurs at every instant within the cup. And it's a very simple kind of relevance realization that happens within the cup. It's not as rich as me, because I have a lot more possibilities than the cup does, but it's still something analogous. And in any given thing that actually exists, you have this top-down emanation, this bottom-up emergence, and this relevance realization between the two. Does that help?
Yeah, it helps a lot. And it brought to mind this example that I've been thinking about, and it's in terms of emergence and emanation. So if we can think of, football, American football, right? So let's think of the New England Patriots. They were a dominant team for 15 years, right? So how can we think of these ideas in terms of emergence and emanation? So the game plan, the coach Belichick, right? He constrains the team with the game plan in terms of what they can do, how they run the ball, what their passing attack's going to be like. And then the team is operationalizing or is emerging and using the game plan in order to win the Super Bowl. So let's say, right? So Tom Brady, in this example, would be the mediator between the coach's plan and the team's execution of that plan. And the logos of that would be the championships. So you can understand if how relevance realization is happening by the end goal. So did you win the Super Bowl? Yes. Have you been winning it year over year? Yes. How have you been doing that? Because there's coherence between the game plan, the coach's game plan, the team's execution of the game plan, and then Tom Brady or the quarterback's, materialization or explication of the game plan with the team, and what that would look like is a successful football team. And I see that is a microcosm, a fractal that works at every different level. And the idea that you brought up with the cup, how do you know if things are working appropriately with the cup? Does it hold water? Does it break? Does it keep your water cold or hot, depending on what your kind of end goal is there? So, that was a great example, and it's crystallizing this idea of, man as mediator between heaven and earth, heaven being this process of emanation, and an earth being emergence. And in the middle, you like logos drives relevance realization, in a sense. That's what came to mind when you were thinking like that. So the idea of logos, the idea of the appropriate way to inhabit a body and a community is through the logos. And I think relevance realization is a great word. And I was thinking, before, it's like, what drives relevance realization? And just seeing that example for me, I'm like, oh, it's the logos. And John Vervaeke comes up, and I guess this will be nice in my next question here. He talks about dialogos, and I'm like, oh, that resonates. I like the idea there, but I think you would have to have the logos manifest in the individual's participating to make it a dialogos, right? You have to have logos in the individual first before you can dialogue and have dialogos. And I think I don't know. That's kind of a new idea that I've been thinking about. But into my next question here that goes to that, where would you say that you and John Vervaeke are making progress with regards to cohering together on an understanding of miracles, and what is the key sticking point?
That's a good question. I think it's still something that I'm working on, although not as much. I think so during the conversation, I think that I tried to, let's say what I wanted to say within John's system, and it didn't quite work out. And John seemed so convinced that I thought that I just had like fundamentally not thought enough about the subject. So that's what I went in and did some research, and afterwards I think it mainly came down to the fact that we would have needed, I think, more time, and I should have been more clear, more explicit about the whole metaphysical framework that I was using. And things get really difficult because even, I tried to dig. I think that the basic idea is the problem that John sees is if you start to allow in miracles, let's say if you allow the fact that emanation from the creator into the creation can produce radically new phenomena, like if radically new patterns can enter into creation, there's a risk that this will undermine too much the patterns that hold within creation. And the issue here is not just something from the outside of patterns changing within creation. It's also that, okay, if the patterns change within creation too much, this has a real undermining effect on our own cognition too.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it's true that patterns make the world, it's not just the fact that, okay, so patterns create things outside. The patterns are also what we perceive when we perceive the world. So if you introduce miracles that break too much the current patterns in the world, you don't just change things in the world, you're also breaking your own cognition. So, and if you do that, then you're losing your all arguments. Like you're undermining your own cognition, you're undermining your own arguments. So like you're cutting off your own you're cutting off yourself at the knees, really. So I think the biggest issue then between John and me was that I don't see, let's say, Christ's miracles as events that bring new patterns that undermine our current cognition. I think they ultimately enhance our own cognition. They do break our frames locally, but I think that over the long term, they make our cognition more powerful. They make the world more intelligible. One way to see it, I think, is there are tons of good examples of this when people witness miracles and they're shocked and confused, but then ultimately they get to understand better. The most dramatic example, perhaps, is Paul's conversion. So Paul lives a miraculous event where Christ speaks to him after Christ has died and has ascended, and this is not supposed to happen within, let's say, the world as Paul saw it. And this has the effect of not only something occurred ontologically, where, let's say, a new pattern manifested itself onto creation, you also saw that it broke Paul's own cognition. Like he couldn't see for 3 days. I think, like it broke his own cognition in a way that he couldn't even see the patterns in the world for 3 days. Like he had to rebuild his own cognition after this. But after he did so, he wasn't like actually broken forever. He actually rebuilt better than he was before, and then he had a huge impact on like human civilization in general. Like he completely changed the world, and for the better, I would argue, because he was ultimately able to see the patterns of the world better. So I think that, so I guess there are two aspects of, let's say, what remains between John and me at this point. So on the one end, I think we would need to dig deeper into the metaphysics, and I wrote a response article where I tried to do this. I detailed the metaphysics more extensively. So we could dig into, okay, so what patterns exactly, like how is it that miracles emerge into creation? Like
Mhm.
how is it that new patterns actually come in the same way that you can see patterns coming in when conscious patterns emanate onto our neurons, you can see new patterns emerging. How does this kind of thing happen between creator and creation too? So that's on the metaphysics side. And I think it's also then a lot of symbolic work to make the case that the way that these metaphysical changes occur don't actually break our intelligibility, but ultimately extend it. So locally, we do lose some of our uh, intelligibility, like Paul, who couldn't see for 3 days. But over the long run, I do think that we come to see the world more clearly if we take in Christian miracles. But this also takes time. I think you need to work through lots of the symbolism before this becomes viable. And lots of people sense it, even people who, let's say, don't care about the metaphysics, they don't buy miracles, including Christian miracles, because they can feel that it just breaks their worldview. Like it breaks it
Mhm.
without giving them something better behind it. So I think people can feel it, and that's why lots of people reject miracles, and it takes time for it to become viable metaphysically, or even to become viable existentially. To see that those miracles give you more that they break in your cognition.
Yeah, well said. That brought up so much. It's from the scientific worldview, there was one miracle, the Big Bang, where the whole world came and became out of nothing, and then from there, it's just been mechanical processes. And if you bring up miracles, it's like you're a crazy superstitious person. But a lot came up there, and I thought the idea of emanation in terms of powers and principalities, right? So the idea of being a New Yorker, right? New York has a certain feel to it that is both the individual New Yorkers that live there, but also this character that it takes on from the interaction of being a New Yorker. So that came up with me. And then also what came up for me is this idea of breaking patterns in order for them to be rebuilt. And in terms of psychedelics, you can take very high doses of psychedelics and let's say DMT. And what that does, and what we're seeing a lot with a lot of research, is that it helps with post-traumatic stress disorder. It helps with addiction and substance abuse. There are some cases where heroin addicts that have been through every kind of course of treatment went down into South America and took ibogaine and had treatments that completely cured them. So what does it mean to be cured? That is a miracle. And what has happened is this this was introduced into the consciousness that broke the patterns, which the patterns of addiction, in a sense, in a person's life that could be eventually reorganized appropriately to live a more coherent life. But if you do it too much, or if you break the patterns, they won't come back together, and you will lose the thread of being in the world, in a sense. So there is this kind of yin yang, this kind of right way to work through that. And like you were saying, the effects that Christianity had, the subversive effects in terms of the type of society that Christ was bringing his love and his ideas in, are profound. Tom Holland's book does a great job of articulating that, but of how the world was, with how families were, with the individual father. Individual father was like a little tyrant who could, kill and on a whim one of his children. And the way that Roman soldiers, the way that Roman government was, and this little seed that developed into the Christian ethic and the Christian worldview that we take for granted now is in a sense a miracle. And I think this is coming back in these different conversations, right? So this idea of unconditional love, this idea of the logos, this idea of integrating heaven and earth, it's going to break patterns that are currently that we're under sway, that hold sway under humanity. So it's going to be difficult, and it's going to look, no matter how it turns out, it's going to look tough and disintegrating for a while, right? But again, coming into that idea of trust and faith, and the idea of the unification of multiplicity, you have to have faith in that, in a sense. And I think another kind of gap, I think, that you touched on in your talk to bridge this idea of miracles in terms of the scientific perspective, is the placebo effect. There's been a lot of work in kind of the New Age world, and there was a book called "You Are the Placebo Effect." You heard that book?
Oh, doesn't ring a bell.
I forgot who it was, but it talks about how, you know, this thing in science that is thrown out as a remainder, right? The placebo effect is in itself what needs to be appropriated, you know, and how can someone taking a sugar pill thinking that it is something that's going to cure a migraine and the migraine gets cured? In research, in terms of scientific research, that's looked at as an anomaly at, you know, 30%. If it happens more than 30%, then the drug is good. So that's not an anomaly. That's something that we need to dig into and what that is. And I think that continuing the discussion there with regards to miracles and the placebo effect, or how your body takes a banana and turns it into JP, you know, these things that they're so obvious, they happen right in front of our eyes. We just can't appropriate that they are essentially miracles, you know? So excellent, man. Yeah. Couple more questions, man. I don't want to keep you too much longer here.
Yeah, sure. We have about 10, 15 minutes now.
Beautiful. Perfect.
Cool.
Okay. Hold on one second here.
And let's say Paul's conversion.
Mm-hmm.
Because, okay, in general, within the Christian or most traditional contexts, really, like, you don't just break the intelligibility that someone has and then leave that person there. You try to replace it by some other principality. Let's say if Saint Paul is taken within, let's say, some bad Pharisee principalities, and then Christ breaks them, you know, he replaces that by the church principality. Like, now Paul is taken out of this principality and he gets taken up into this other one. Same thing with baptism. Let's say you get taken out of, let's say, your sins, your bad principalities, and then you get taken up into the body of Christ, a better one. So this is distinct from at least psychedelics, the way they're often taken these days, where you get taken out of, let's say, your bad principalities, but you don't necessarily get taken up into like great ones. Like, it's like the story there is not always that clear. Like, people don't have the, so even in traditional societies that would use those psychedelics, they often add, let's say, rituals and like more established traditions that would take people in after they would take those experiences. They would do those experiences. So yeah, I think it's a good example. I think it's a good case where nowadays people are having so many issues because of the meaning crisis, because of the philosophical problems we talked about earlier, that they're willing to just break those patterns. And even if they don't have a clear principality to get taken up into instead, like, they're still willing to take that axe to their principalities, even if it's not clear what they'll end up with. And they still they still think that it's better in general to do this because they're stuck into such bad principalities.
Yeah, well said. And I can tell you, like, from a personal perspective, about 6 years ago, I had this experience with psychedelics and with meditation, and I was doing Kundalini yoga intensely and meditating, and I had tremendous experiences, and I would, and it almost ruined my marriage. I had an extreme experience where I was like, oh wow, I quit my lucrative job to start teaching meditation. I started doing Reiki, which is a hands-on healing type thing. I started doing teaching classes of Qigong, which is doing energy work, because it had such an effect of breaking these old principalities in my life. But what was being rebuilt was not a coherent new world view. I was being manipulated by being rootless and trying to explore all these different Eastern mystical traditions and continuing to work with psychedelics and meditation. I caution people that don't take these ideas or don't take these plants lightly, because they work, in a sense. They will break the pattern, and there are powers and principalities or beings at higher level that, you know, if you poke your head into hyperspace, right, you will encounter beings, especially in terms of the DMT space. I've been thinking recently about, you know, DMT, dimethyltryptamine. It's one of the most powerful psychedelics, and you take it and you have what's called a breakthrough. So you take 3 huge inhalations, and then you leave your body, and you will go and see entities, some that are very conniving, some entities you'll encounter and they'll just look at you and ignore you and continue doing what they're doing. Other ones look like with wheels within wheels. You know, you're actually entering the spiritual space that it's not meant for us, because we don't have the spiritual maturity. You know, so if you're dealing with the psychedelics and you're dealing with Eastern traditions that's not rooted in a deep tradition, like you're saying, it's not built in with rituals and support, you're opening yourself up to stuff that you don't understand. And you're going to go from not believing in this stuff to having experienced it, and now it's going to have a disintegrating effect on your life. And I'm glad I have found, I was opened up, and then through, Jordan Peterson, and then finding, reorient myself with my Greek Orthodox tradition, and finding the church fathers was tremendous. That was the biggest thing, because it was everything that I was searching for and reading in Eastern mystical traditions. Taoism, I still appreciate Taoism very much, was articulated so succinctly and beautifully in the church fathers. And growing up as a Greek Orthodox, going to church, I'd never heard of the church fathers. I never heard of the Jesus prayer. I never heard of any of that until a few years ago. So I'm thankful that that opening happened, and that I was able to find this this symbolic way of looking that has had tremendously positive effects in my life, and has connected me with excellent, wonderful people. So a word of caution with regards to psychedelics, tread lightly. I think Peterson says, it was Jung. He says, be aware of unearned wisdom, right? So you can be chopped down again, the pattern breaks and it's not able to cohere again. But yeah, no, very interesting. I didn't have any questions about this, but you brought it up. What are your thoughts? What is sin?
Well, traditionally, it's just missing the mark of, not, let's say, not embodying the pattern that you're supposed to embody. And then, for depending on the scale at which you're operating, is going to be more or less serious. Sometimes it's just going to be a sin that only affects you. For instance, you're not, by your own admission, you're not following the patterns that you should be following. And sometimes it's going to be bigger. Like maybe you're supposed to participate this way into the pattern of your church. Maybe you have some important function and you're supposed to, let's say, help people do something. And then if you fail in that pattern, then you miss the mark. You've missed the pattern. So I think it's just what sin is in general. And then you have to, in practice, learn to discern your sins better and better, and root them out bit by bit. Leaving, as we said earlier, leaving those bad principalities, those bad patterns that you're stuck into, and then jumping into the good ones.
Yeah, that again. So how can we, from a symbolic perspective, and from this idea of sin missing the mark, how can we understand something like the 10 Commandments? Would you say that's a type of a fundamental code to follow that will generate right relationship between self and other? A lot of these are thought of archaic, and why would God care about these rules? Sleeping with another man's wife, lying, cheating. It's like, oh, these are for children to scare them. But if you look at it from this symbolic perspective, to sin is if you're jealous of your neighbor's car every time he gets a new thing, then you're going to want one, right? And you start this kind of mimetic rivalry, from a Girardian perspective, that always ends in disaster or disintegration, whether it's in the relationship or within yourself. How can we think of the 10 Commandments from this symbolic worldview?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can, on the one end, a good place to start is to see them as constraints on what you should do. Like they're emanating patterns that are coming from God to constrain what we do individually and within societies. They're sort of guardrails we shouldn't go past by. And if we follow those, then if we follow those guidelines, if we respect those constraints, if we can even say it better, if we allow ourselves to be constrained by those laws, then we will get taken up into higher and level patterns, even if we can't see them right away. In the same way that, let's say, if when a parent embodies certain patterns and tells some things to a child, the child doesn't understand what's going on, what's behind those patterns. But over time, as the child respects those patterns and sometimes strays off, but then gets taken back in, eventually the child comes to understand the meaning of those patterns, of the constraints that the parent is placing upon them. And it allows the child to keep growing and growing to see the patterns better. So eventually, if we respect, let's say, the commandments, we come to see better why they're there, like what's their value, what kinds of patterns are they taking us into. And even if we don't respect them and we transgress and eventually things get worse, then we also see that, okay, well, those patterns were there for a reason. So, and over time, we can say more explicitly why those patterns are there. Like in practice, what happens if you don't follow them? Like you brought up Girard. Girard has great analyses of why those particular commandments are there. Why Moses was able to, it's really a great. I don't know if you read Saint Gregory's The Life of Moses. He explains it really well. But Moses ascends up the mountain, a place where no one is able to follow him. At some point when he's ascending, I think they have to leave the animals behind, and then at some point, like people are hearing trumpets, and only Moses can keep ascending. At some point, he has to remove like his sandals and so on. And so Moses is the only one who is able to ascend to those higher level patterns, to leave the beasts behind, and even to leave, let's say, the common people behind. And he reaches the place on top of the mountain where he's able to see everything and everyone. And simultaneously, as he's seeing all that, he's receiving the laws from above. There's an emanation from God that constrains what Moses can see. He sees the patterns that there's all kinds of potential ways that people could be arranged under Moses, the one on the mountain. Like he could literally see all those people and how they behave. And he wrote the 10 Commandments in a way that would, once Moses comes down, those patterns that came from higher would regulate what's lower in ways that the people that were below that didn't understand. They didn't have access to what Moses did. Only Moses was able to rise to this place. Now, even lower, later in the story, there's a few people who would like to be priests, like Aaron or Moses, I think, and like they run into issues. They can't ascend to those patterns, and if we attempt to do it like too soon, we won't get it, or we will break the patterns. Like not everyone can reach to that place. It's something we all have to strive for. But yeah, so I think it's through all of those let's say those practices, these attempts to understand like what was Moses doing in the Exodus? Like what happens if I try to follow those patterns? Like what's the meaning of laws emanating onto people? Like it's super rich, but it's by trying to embed yourselves within all of those different symbolic paths that you'll come to see better why they work, and in particular why the 10 Commandments, for instance.
Yeah, wonderful. I actually have it right here. It's a short, small book. I've read it several times. I read it on my YouTube channel. I have a series where I got through most of it, and it's really profound. Book 1 talks about the story of Moses, and book 2 talks about how to relate this story to our life. And he was writing this, what was it, the 5th century? I can't remember exactly when he was writing this, but the correlations and the resonances and the insights that it has on a modern life in 2020 are insane. They're phenomenal. I highly recommend that book, by the way. It's very short and it's very edifying. It's good to engage with. So I'm glad that you brought that up. I did have this question that I think you set it up nicely. How did you come about the work of Rene Girard, and what effect did it have on your life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I heard about him probably listening to Paul Van Clay's podcast a while ago, and then eventually I listened to more podcasts on him, listened to some interviews, read a few books, talked to a few people too. I was able to talk a few times with Craig Stewart. He talked with Jonathan and also with Paul. Yeah, we talked a few times, and Girard helped me see a lot of the symbolism that occurs within groups. He has some really profound insights into how groups can organize, how people can come together for better or for worse. And yeah, so I tried to integrate him into some of the symbolism that I already knew. And so I guess this is all fairly common stuff. I'd say that maybe the deepest thing, yeah, because I got a lot from him, and rather than trying to list a bunch of stuff that would be fairly standard, maybe I can just say that the biggest thing that I got from Girard was it really allowed me to deepen let's say my understanding of Christ's self-sacrifice, and its relationship with creation in general. And it's been a while since I thought about it this much. So I may not be able to do it justice, but the basic insight, I think, is that because Girard focuses so much on sacrifice and how it can be done badly, and then contrasts it with how it can be done well in the case of Christ, and how we should emanate that pattern. We talked about how we should leave bad principalities that ultimately lead to the sacrifice of others. All the scapegoating we engaging, all of those dark principalities, we should leave them and jump into a good one, which is Christ's principality of self-sacrifice, where you sacrifice yourself for others, for the people you're responsible for. And by making this explicit link with, say, the reality of how groups that exist by a self-sacrifice, you can see that this is true of groups, that groups all together because of the self-sacrifice of the leader. But it's true at the different scales of reality. Like a good company works because the CEO is willing to sacrifice himself for the people that are below him. A father can hold the family together by sacrificing himself for his family. Even if you look lower, I talked with Jonathan a while ago, on even in digestion, just to eat something, you have to sacrifice part of yourself. At some point, you have to give up some of your molecules to take in the molecules of what you're eating. Like, for things to exist, they need the self-sacrifice of their head. And this allows you to get a glimpse into how the world itself, how creation holds together. Because God, who is behind creation, who is in a sense the head of creation, and you don't want to fall into just a pantheism there, because you don't want to say that creation is God's body. It's the distance is much greater between creator and creation than it is between the head and the body. But still, the head and body symbolism allows you to get a glimpse into the relationship between creator and creation, the pattern and its manifestation. And by the fact that it's a group, something, an entity can only hold together because of the self-sacrifice of its head, it allows you to get a glimpse of how creation as a whole holds together because of the self-sacrifice of God behind creation. So you get this fact that it's, and I think I remember now what was especially touching to me was because even before the self-sacrifice happens of, let's say, the parents for their children, even before the self-sacrifice happens, the actual creation of the children has to take place, and during that creation, during the sexual union between the parents, this act of creation is also a promise of self-sacrifice, for one another and for the children. So this act of creation, is embedded within a framework where both parties know that they have to self-sacrifice for their offspring and for each other. So this relationship between, let's say, creation, love, and self-sacrifice becomes really, really close. And you can see that this, mystery of how things exist and are created by a self-sacrifice, it takes place within a family, but it also takes place between, let's say, the father and the son when they create the world, and they know full well that Christ will have to sacrifice himself, and that the father will have to sacrifice his son for the world. So this dynamic that people can see in the icon of marriage, they can also get a glimpse of between creator and creation. And it's really deep, and it makes the marriage something like super rich. So I think this symbolism will in general be very useful just in my family life in general.
Wow, well said. And so much you brought up for me. I'm glad you're just talking about how, a husband and wife, when they become married and they commit to themselves, they commit to each other, they sacrifice part of their identity, part of the potential of who they could have been individually in order to cohere as a whole, as one flesh. Same thing is, and this was a weird thought that came up, we bring, our kids into the world, we sacrifice them to the world because they know they're going to perish. Like, we bring them into the world and they will have to face the world, and I think what's missing here is this idea of self-sacrifice at the very core of Girard. And I think it's missing specifically in the political. It's more in the corporate. You see it emerging, but it's kind of emerging elsewhere. But in the political, there's this stale broken down system that exactly that is missing. You see all of these derelict politicians whose decisions caused havoc on the world, and they don't even step down from their position. You know, there was Dr. Birx. She was the one of the head of the coronavirus task force here in the United States. And she was caught out with her family while she was telling everybody to wear a mask and not go out. And she went out with her family. And I give her credit because she stepped down. She stepped down last week. And I'm like, you know what I'm saying? Like, step down if you, you know, and that, I think it's what's missing in the political space and kind of on the individual level as well. And I just quickly on Gerard, you know, I find him fascinating because he was in the milieu of this postmodern ethic ethos of you know, what to do with desire. You know, Freud thought that desire is a result of a lack from castration. You know, and then Deleuze and Guattari thought that the desire, no, it's not a result of a lack. It is a productive, creative force that we need to invest in the world. And what we invest in, you know, realizes our being in a sense. But I think Gerard, with his mimetic rivalry and understanding this process of mimesis, is that we copy each other, and that the idol, the thing that we're copying, eventually becomes a stumbling block. And that stumbling block leads to a dissolution or a disintegration of the identity that you thought you had. You know, that's why I think a lot of times you see in midlife crisis where you have chased all the idols, the money, the career, the reputation. And then once you achieve them, the bubble bursts, right? And then what do you invest your desire in there, right? As your identity disintegrates, you're just looking to invest in identity. So it's buy the Porsche, get the new girlfriend, you know, whatever it may be, trying to hold on to this identity that you thought was what was real, which was what society and culture has told us. But once you reach it, you fall into a depression. And you see the people that are the most well off in our society, their kids have the highest suicide rate, the highest mental health issues. And what I think Gerard found in his conversion to Christianity was this: if you invest your desire in Christ, he is the one that will not be a stumbling block for you. Like, he will not, the way that you imitate Christ is not in any other mimetic fashion that you would imitate others to acquire more things, in a sense. And I'm still trying to digest the insight there, but you said it nicely in this idea of self-sacrifice. You know, at the individual level, you have habits that you've had for 10, 20 years, right? That they become your idols. And whatever it may be, you have to sacrifice those habits, those identities that make part of who you are, in order to move on in your relationships with others. So this self-sacrifice is fractal at every level. If you know, everybody's had a good leader or a good boss that genuinely cares about others and will go out of their way to make concessions in their own lives for the goodness of their people. We see that happen in all different levels. We see where it's not happening, and it's clear where it's not happening, but it's just not clear how to make it happen, or how to, you know, you can't force a realization on someone, and you can't.
I think it's encouraging though, because I think we're seeing it pop up in different areas. Like, it's popping up in companies. Like, you can see it sometimes in sports figures or in different podcasts. Like, I used to listen a lot to Jocko Willink's podcast, where he talks about leadership, about the military, about business. And, you know, he's clearly this sort of self-sacrificial figure that makes things and people better around him because of this self-sacrifice, and people recognize it. I think it's one encouraging thing right now that's going on amongst all of our crises and our degeneration of hierarchies right now. It's becoming clearer what good hierarchies look like, what good patterns look like. In a way, I think the symbolic worldview is more attractive now than it would have been for a long time. Like, I think it's the most attractive right now than it has been for a while, because our patterns are so broken that people can recognize more easily when good patterns show up. Like, people can recognize that Joko is someone worth emulating, for instance. People can recognize the kind of companies that they want working, and it's the ones that have the good symbolism, that have the self-sacrificial CEOs, and so on. I think it's one encouraging thing right now, that we see those good patterns emerging because people recognize it. I don't know when it will pop up in politics, but I think it will have to at some point.
Yeah, and that's why, you know, I have my Vote Kanye sweater on here, and people think it's silly, but what he's articulating and what he's bringing into the political discourse is not about him becoming president. He's throwing in ideas, in terms of the fool archetype. He's throwing out traditional ideas that seem radical in the upside down world that we're living in. But like we talk about, the fool is there to flip the hierarchy, right? When the hierarchy becomes too calcified, too rigid, the hierarchy acts as a fool in the carnival sense, to show that the emperor has no clothes. So how do you show that the emperor has no clothes when the hierarchy has become too disintegrated, right? It's going to look like, Jonathan Peugeot's artwork. It's going to look like talking about traditional marriage and talking about, a lot of his songs, are really him reflecting on these ideas. He has this one song where he talks about, he talks about his friend. He's talking about how he just bought a new sports car, and his son said, oh, and his friend said, hey, my daughter just got her new report card, and he talks about all this, and he's kind of working it out himself, which I find interesting and fascinating. But yeah, man, very cool. I guess another kind of question.
I think we can do this one, and afterwards I'll have to go.
Perfect.
Yeah, cool.
Let me see. I have one for you, but I think we'll leave that one. Maybe we can just talk about prayer. What are your thoughts on prayer, and how does it work in your life, and how can you kind of understand how it works?
Well, I think there are, it's, I guess, two movements, and it depends on what kind of prayer too. We already talked about liturgy earlier, which is a form of prayer where you get involved into the actual coherence of a community, all organized within the coherence of a church, within the coherence of the entire creation with its creator. So this is one thing where it's both an emergent movement and an emanating movement, where you can see how different people emerge together into communities, into nature as a whole, and ultimately into union with the creator. So it's a bottom-up movement. Prayer is a bottom-up movement on the one end, where we try to reach higher up, and it's also a top-down movement where higher level patterns can emanate down the hierarchy, so that, let's say, the pattern of Christ can emanate into the different churches and into the different parishes and into the different parishioners. So it's a move. So you can see church as a movement where we try to ascend up into higher level patterns, and where higher level patterns descend down into us. It's most obvious within liturgy, because you're literally in a group setting with different people, so you can clearly see and feel how you cohere together with the different people you're with. But the same kind of thing happens also if you're in individual prayer too. It's just harder to see because you don't have the different people physically close to you, but you're still praying in conjunction with all kinds of people. You're still connected yourself to your church with different other Christians. So the same kind of phenomena where you try to reach into higher level patterns, and you try to afford higher level patterns emanating down into you. And so, I mean, practically in individual prayer, I think the way it works best with me is often around the time that I'm actually working on symbolism. Let's say if I'm working on the blog, I really had this feeling powerfully when I was working on miracles, because miracles is really about how the lower can come down into the lower, and how the lower can emerge into the higher. So it was very vivid during that time. Let's say if I was praying all by myself during that time, I could see, as you're saying certain words, let's say you're reciting the words of a certain prayer. So on the one end, this is a top-down movement where you're saying the words of an entire community, words that have been crafted by who knows how many people, with ultimately Christ behind them. There's this whole chain coming from Christ where the words of the prayers were crafted, for instance, and then it came down to you. So as you say those words, it will change you, so that you will come to be transformed, and you will come to embody those patterns, so that there's this clear chain where a higher level pattern of Christ coming down through the generations to you, to your prayer, changes you. So it's a top-down movement. And it's also, you can also see it bottom up, as you are making the effort, you're arranging your day so that you can set yourself in a place where from all of the potential that you had, you get constrained into seeing just these particular words. So it's simultaneously you trying to emerge into higher level patterns, and higher level patterns emanating down into you.
Wow, that's beautifully said. So just lastly, can you participate in the liturgy or in the worship of the highest high without going to church, you think? And can you do it in an individual prayer? You just articulated it nicely, but is that akin to a liturgical worship?
I think it's possible, but it's more difficult. Like, they are hermits. Like, it's a small group of monks that can become hermits, and they really do participate, at very high levels into this, and they're connected with the church. We're in communion with them, but it's not as obvious, and it's a very particular vocation. Most people, if they try to just pray by themselves, it won't reach as high as they would within a liturgy. But some people are generally called to be hermits. So it's just that the sort of thing that you have to be careful for. You can't make rules for the exceptionals. Some people are exceptional, and they'll do their own thing and bring up the rest of the people with them. But we should be careful to imitate them.
Yeah. No, I think that I think of the Mount Athos monks, right? I think of them as the cultural stem cells, like that we can get we do get resources from, because they're, encountering the highest high, and that's something where we can go to revivify the culture. So anyways, that was a great discussion. There's a lot more places we can go, and maybe we'll have another part 2. But
sure.
Yeah, I want to thank you for coming on. I really enjoyed it, and I hope that everybody enjoyed it. And I wish you the blessed rest of your Sunday.
Yeah, thank you, James. Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun, and have a good Merry Christmas, and also Happy New Year in just a few days.
Absolutely. Happy New Year. Thanks, man. Thanks.
Bye, James.
Bye.